And if you boiled my dissertation research down into one general idea, it's to investigate the human environmental relationship over time and to understand the impacts that humans are placing on estuarine resources. And I do this by studying shells and bones and the isotopes within those from different contexts, such as shell mounds and shell middens and historic trash heaps. I read a lot of historic newspapers and historical accounts and some more. And today I'm going to be talking specifically about oysters and how you all are making a difference in my research in understanding oysters in Tampa Bay today and also in the past. Oysters are a critical species to have. Some ecologists have called them the most important species on the planet for all of the ecosystem services they provide. They filter water, prevent shoreline erosion, and provide food and shelter for countless species. Unfortunately, Tampa Bay has lost about 90% of our reefs since the 1900s, and that's about 35 million tons. And I'll talk more about all of the different reasons for that loss. But there's numerous agencies like the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, Tampa Bay Watch, and FWC that actively monitor and restore reefs through innovative technologies like the domes and vertical gardens. And when you're thinking about oyster management, life history traits like age, growth, and size are often needed in management, but the scientific collection of these data only goes back to about 1950. So one of the goals of my research is to kind of extend that back using historic and archaeological data. And this general idea is known as a shifting baseline, and archaeology and paleobiology can help correct for this. I think of it like a J curve with human pressures being exponentially increasing through time. And by only looking at 1950, you're only really looking at the top bit of the graph. So my research is going to help contextualize all of these changes. So I've been working at archaeological sites throughout Tampa Bay. These are typically shell mounds or shell middens. And as you can see in the center photo, very dense shell matrices. Most of the shell mounds in Tampa Bay are constructed of oyster, but we have basically every species that you're familiar with, all the conchs and whelks, shark eye. We don't have any Junonia though. But we do have plenty of really cool species, and I'm really privileged to be able to work at a lot of these sites. As you can see from the photo in the top left and on the right, I often work below the water table, and that's because when these were constructed, sea levels were lower. And so over the last 1,000 years, sea levels have risen. So now we need to use a pump to get the water out so we can get beneath the water table. And in the photo in the right, you can see, coincidentally, when we get beneath the water table, we often find these colossal oysters. Like this one is just shy of 20 centimeters, which is a little bit smaller than 8 inches. And these are pretty common in certain shell mounds, and definitely the lower you go, you seem to find a lot of these. But I'm not only looking at oysters in the past. As you can see the photo in the bottom left, I also visit modern reefs, and this is just to get a feel for the size and the other critters that like hanging out there, and the presence of barnacles and sponge parasitism, just to kind of get a feel for, when I look at archaeological shells, what environment they could most likely come from. And you can see that's my fancy research vessel, my kayak that gets me from reef to reef. So what we do is we do standard archaeological excavation. This is test units. And then we take all that shell back and analyze it in the lab. And I'll share some of specifically the analyses that I do back at the lab. But I did want to kind of contextualize the importance of this study and some of these historical accounts that I've found. These are absolutely amazing to me. But George McCall, who was a lieutenant stationed at Fort Brooke, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide, called Tampa Bay the finest oyster ground on the continent. James Metcalf said that oysters are larger and finer than any I ever saw. The Jacksonville Times said they earned raves for their size, fatness, and delicacy of flavor, comparing favorably even to the more renowned Chesapeake Bay treasures. And R.S. Warner said, to those who have eaten Tampa Bay oysters, either raw, stewed, or fried, it is needless to extol their virtues. And A. Smelts, who said, I found these immense reefs and beds of oysters in such seemingly inexhaustible supplies that it frequently occurred to me that the great God of nature must have gone ahead of me and with hands wide open scattered right and left and out into the depths so far that I failed to find their limits. What's really fascinating about the last quote by Smelts is he wasn't a local to Tampa Bay, and he revisited Tampa Bay about 20 or 25 years later. And he talks a lot about the fisheries decline. He notices that a lot of the reefs are smaller, the oysters are smaller, and he talks about how there needs to be more management or to kind of take a step back and let them recover. But spoiler alert, we didn't do that. So I did find a pretty interesting map from 1888, and it's kind of noting a bunch of different fisheries. But I did notice there's about 5 or 6 circles, and these show areas with oyster beds that have been exhausted. I'm assuming that they're just been over harvested from people living at Fort Brooke, which was a military settlement. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's about right here near the mouth of the Hillsborough River. That was Fort Brooke, basically the first settlement in Tampa Bay. So I think all of the people were exhausting the oysters, and it's kind of juxtaposed to all of those quotes that I find absolutely amazing as a Tampa Bay local, that someone would call Tampa Bay, the finest oyster ground on the continent. Humans have been harvesting oysters for at least 3,000 years. We have the radiocarbon dates and the oysters to prove it. And, with shell mound building and just general subsistence, that's put a lot of pressure on oysters. I don't know if many of you have been to shell mounds, but if you're local to Sanibel-Captiva, Mound Key and Mound House are great ones to visit. You can really appreciate how many oysters go into a shell mound, probably hundreds of millions, and that likely had an effect on the estuary resources. Of course, I've talked about some of the 1800s overharvesting. Another important factor that has led to the decline of oysters is pollution. With increasing populations in Pinellas and Hillsborough counties, we've got a lot of pollution, a lot of sewage entering the bay. And unfortunately, this isn't, only in the past. We're still dealing with environmental pollution. For those up to date on their current events, Piney Point is releasing a bunch of phosphate mining wastewater, about millions of gallons a day. And that's unfortunately, it's heartbreaking, and it's going to likely kill a lot of wildlife in Tampa Bay. We also have a lot of dredging, the shipping channels. We dredged a lot of the bay in order to make more waterfront property, and a lot of mosquito ditching. And also the oyster reefs themselves were mined for road fill and for other things. And the accounts of that, people are saying that oyster reefs averaged about 18 feet thick, which is just, unbelievable to me. So we know kind of all of these things that are likely to have impacted oysters, but the purpose of my research is to understand how. So I'm looking at shell measurements, a bunch of different types of measurements. I'm looking at things like parasitism and comparing all of those through time. And we're also using geochemical techniques like stable isotope and 2 different lasering methods, LIBS and LAIS-PMS. So for the measurements, I wanted to focus on height because that's the one that most people are familiar with, and that's the one that environmental managers seem to focus on. So this black bar right here is from the top to the bottom of the oyster. That's shell height. So when we compare the 4 different time periods in my study, the woodland period, for the purposes of my project, are about 200 AD until 1000 AD. And we see just a lot of those colossal oysters. And then we see during the Mississippian period, which is about 1000 to 1500, a really steep decline in the size of oysters. And I think this is mostly related to a combination of overharvesting and increasing populations in Native Americans, and also potentially the Little Ice Age, which is in between these areas. So I think both of those likely had an effect on the size of oysters. Right in the between here, after the Mississippian, we have European contact. There's a lot of spread of disease and violence. and the populations in Tampa Bay are diminished. And really, not many people, if any, are living in Tampa Bay during this 300-year period. All of my historic oysters come from Fort Brooke, which is on the mouth of the Hillsborough River. And we see that they, again, increase in size and pretty significantly. So this gap without a lot of people harvesting them gave oysters the ability to recover and rebound, and pretty significantly. Not like they were, 1,000 years prior, but pretty decently. And then, all of that not so fun stuff, the pollution, the dredging, over harvesting, all of that comes after. And we see again another decline in the size of modern oysters. But what I found interesting is I thought it was pretty cool, or maybe not cool, but it was interesting that the modern ones are larger than they were in the Mississippi. So I found that pretty interesting. Just so it's not just a box plot you're looking at, these are what they look like. We have the woodland, Mississippian, 1800s, and then modern. So you can see some pretty sharp differences between these. But size is really only one part of the story. We also have to look at age. Neither one gives you really the complete picture. So Stephen Hesterberg is a PhD student in the biology program at USF. He's also in Greg Herbert's lab. He also compared archaeological oysters with modern oysters further north in the Big Bend area. And he showed that modern oysters have a shorter lifespan and slower growth rate compared to those about 1,000 years prior, even though they're the same size, which I found really interesting. And that's kind of what I'm expecting to happen too. What's kind of interesting about oysters living in Florida is we can't just count the growth bands like you can in some other shells. And that's because of the warmer waters. In cooler regions like the Chesapeake, this is a cross-section of the hinge to expose the band. So this is the hinge of an oyster. And if you were to look at the hinge of an oyster in the Chesapeake, you would be able to reliably count these bands. And that's because they really they shut down their physiological functions during the winter. But that doesn't happen in Florida. In fact, that's something that oyster farmers will brag about. They can grow oysters to market size in like 14 to 16 months because they don't stop growing. So while it's great for them, it's not so great for a researcher like me who wants an easy way to determine the age. So we have to do geochemistry to look at the age. And I'm going to share some of my research with the LIBS and LAI's PMS. So this is LIBS, which stands for laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. And what this does is creates elemental maps of the surface. It basically just pings a laser at a set interval. And for the purposes of this, it was 40 microns, which is just absolutely super small, smaller than a nanometer. And it goes across the shell surface and tells you the elemental composition. So we can see right away, we have these nice growth bands highlighted in yellow. And you can actually, if you look closely, see this straight line. That's another laser beam line that I did. While this looks cool, it's not entirely helpful because when we look at these growth bands, these are different mineral compositions. And what's going on is the laser beam is basically obliterating this more so than the denser material. So different size particles are being analyzed and they have different intensities. So it kind of confirms the growth bands, but it's not really a true picture of magnesium. We want a more consistent material. So we test the foliated calcite layer, which is going to be right here, or right here on this picture. And that's where researchers do their isotopes. So it's really convenient to be able to test the isotopes and the laser in the same area. But it's a really great, LIBS is a really great first step to understand where to expect different elements and what they may mean. Whereas laser ablation takes a single line transect. And so here's a laser ablation line. And basically, you can follow these, determine the age of the shell. And so you can kind of see these bumps. I would say this is about 3, and then maybe 1, 2, 3, 4.5, and then maybe 4. The unfortunate thing is magnesium can sometimes be a little weird. It mostly aligns to oxygen isotopes, but sometimes it does its own little thing. And so we really need isotopes in order to basically ground truth what we're seeing in the magnesium. The Sanibel-Captiva Shell Club is nice enough to help pay for this lasering technique. Unfortunately, I don't have the isotopes quite yet. I got delayed by COVID. I just sent them about a month ago, and I'm waiting for the results. But I do have the laser data and the shell size data, and I think it's going to hold true to what Stephen Hesterberg found in Crystal River, and that's that oysters of the same size are going to be slightly younger in modern contexts. And this laser data is from the modern context. So we have about a market size oyster, about 3-inch oysters, about 3 to 4 years old. So I'm expecting, once I get my isotope data back, to show that the oysters from the archaeological context are just about a year or two older. So that was my presentation. Thank you so much for having me. And I wanted to thank everyone else on there, and I'll stick around for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. That was an excellent presentation.
Well, it's not your area of study. Can you describe the impact of the Piney Point phosphate leak into Tampa Bay on the Mullis there, and why?
Like you mentioned, I'm not an expert on that, but I can give you what I believe, or what I've kind of listened and heard about. With all of the extra nitrogen and phosphorus, I think it has the ability to become anoxic and take away the oxygen and of the water, and basically create dead zones of plumes. I think algae blooms and red tides are going to be one of the more serious consequences of the pumping. And as far as shellfish, I'm actually not sure. Unfortunately, there's an oyster farm just maybe 4 miles or so south. They've already obviously halted harvesting those oysters, and I'm not sure if they're going to be able to filter it out, or if it's a death sentence. I'm sure for most of the fish and wildlife there, it's not great. Hopefully it doesn't contaminate the entire bay, but I think there's just a lot of unknowns. I think there's still mapping and figuring out which direction it's going to go. But other than just thinking that it's just not going to be great, I don't have a great answer for you, Phyllis.
Have the shell mounds around Sanibel been studied, and are the findings consistent with your findings in Tampa Bay?
That's a great question. I can think of one study who only looked at the height, and that was done, I believe it was in Estero Bay, by Michael Savarese, who I think is at FGCU. And he actually showed really not too much of a significant difference in the size between archaeological shells and those in the present, which I found really interesting. And I don't know if it's they didn't dig deep enough in those Calusa mounds or what, but yeah, Savarese has a study in 2015 that looks at the oyster size, and there wasn't really much of a significant difference like we're seeing in Tampa Bay.
When we dig for fossil shells south of Arcadia, we find oyster shells from 1 to 3 million years ago. Are these the same type that you are studying?
That's a great question. I never really think that far back in time as an archaeologist, but I think so. I would have to do some more research on the that long ago. I know Stan Walker, who was at USF St. Pete, he's a geologist. He found the sticky grounds, which is I think just south of the middle grounds out on the shelf, and he found a bunch of little oysters that I was able to take and will analyze in the future. And they don't really look like Eastern oysters. They look like they could be a different species, but I haven't invested a lot of time into figuring out what species they are. So I'm not really sure. I need to do some more research on that. That's a great question.
Yeah, because we find all different kinds. Yeah, from little to huge. So I was just curious if that was the same thing.
What are the causes of the water level rise in the past 2,000 years?
That's going to be from the icebergs melting and those ice sheets melting just over time. And it's kind of, it's the effects of sea level rise are different in each area. So we have a really nice sea level curve for Tampa Bay specifically done by USGS, and I believe they show something like maybe 60 centimeters over the last 500 years or so. But yeah, that's a great curve, and it kind of depends where you're at, but it's all related to ice melting and having different mass after it's melted.
Thank you very much, Jaime. We really appreciate your doing this presentation. It was very interesting.
Well, thank you all. Thanks so much.
Good luck with your research.
Thanks.